how's it going? I just got an email from Adobe. My Creative Cloud subscription basically is ending next month. And it's hard to believe that it's been another year that I've been subscribed to the Adobe Creative Cloud suite. I believe this is now 2 full years that I've been subscribed to the full suite. Am I gonna renew again come next month? I'm kind of on the fence about it. I'm leaning towards no. I think Adobe's really in an interesting place right now, so I just wanted to take this opportunity to basically reflect on my time of ownership, to speculate what might be happening in the future with Adobe, basically just join the discussion in terms of the value of a subscription-based model like Adobe's Creative Cloud versus a traditional, one-time purchase of software, which a lot of companies still use. So for those who don't know, Adobe Creative Cloud is basically how Adobe has sort of marketed and packaged all of its software for the last few years. It's a subscription-based service, which means you pay on a monthly basis for either one app or a small package of apps or the entire suite of applications that they offer. And it also comes with benefits that they tie into their cloud services, which is why it's called Creative Cloud. That's sort of Adobe's version of something like Dropbox, where there's cloud-based storage, which is essentially hard drive space that they offer you online over the internet. And it means that you have a folder on your computer if you set it up, or you can upload files online and then you can access those files from any other computer. And they tie that into their software in some ways. I'll just preface this by saying this is going to be a very casual review. I'm not going to go in depth on all the features or what's changed over the last couple of years. Instead, this is going to be, a very subjective, casual, but honest appraisal of, my experiences as an everyday user. I would say I probably use about 40% of the apps in the suite on a weekly basis. I use at least, I would say 2 to 3 apps, maybe 3 to 4 apps every single day. I think I have a bit of a unique perspective because I work in the film industry, but I mostly came into that through a design background. Going back a few years, I was working in software, then graphic design. Now I do graphic design for film, but I also do some, visual effects, some coloring, some editing, and as an aspiring filmmaker and YouTube creator, of course, I also do, a lot of other video creation work. To that end, I was trained in basically most of the Adobe software back when it was CS5 or CS6. As soon as I graduated, they were essentially transitioning into this Creative Cloud model. I was very much on the fence about, purchasing CS6 at the kind of student discount then versus just subscribing. I kind of regret not subscribing or coming on board as a student because obviously I would have got lower rates, probably locked in for longer. But I will say that I feel like I've got pretty good value for money over the last 2 years as a subscriber, especially since as a small business owner, I can write off a lot of the expenses of the software on an annual basis. With that said, I think I mentioned that I am kind of considering ending the subscription, and I want to get into some reasons why. The other benefits of Creative Cloud versus traditional software, of course, is that they always provide updates. If a new version of any given software comes out, you'll get a notification. You don't have to pay for any upgrades or changes to your software. It basically, as everything becomes available as a subscriber, you can get it right away. And that includes software that might not have been packaged with the Creative Cloud when you originally bought it. So for instance, just recently, Adobe added Character Animator and some other really kind of exciting, interesting applications. On the same token though, what you might not expect is that certain applications will also be retired from their suite, as I've discovered over the last 2 years. Adobe's really good at offering legacy versions of the software to subscribers as well. You can go back, I think, and even still download CS6 as a subscriber, for example. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be supported in the overall Adobe ecosystem. They really have modeled it so that you're updating everything all the time, or at least that everything's on the same generation. So for example, the last 2 releases were Adobe Creative Cloud 2017 and Adobe Creative Cloud 2018, which came out a few months ago, late in 2017. And as you can imagine, if you update, for example, After Effects or Premiere, like a video editing program, but you don't update Adobe Media Encoder, which actually outputs the videos into various formats or converts and compresses them, you can imagine that there becomes some compatibility issues. And there's also just, the regular kind of growing pains. Most of these software releases are not perfect right out the gate, but you're also just not getting an early beta. It's not like they haven't done any testing. and for the most part they're pretty good at making them work together regardless of the generation, but I'm going to talk about some gotchas that I've experienced that really unfortunately bittered my experience over the last 2 years. So as someone who primarily works in the film industry, the applications that I use on a daily basis, it's Adobe Premiere, which is their video editing, After Effects, which is visual effects and sort of 2D animation, motion graphics. It is Adobe Media Encoder, which encodes and compresses videos. I use Photoshop, which is very heavily and tightly integrated with After Effects. I use it both for visual effects in film and for actually graphic design. I do a lot of key art and promotional materials for film projects. I use Illustrator for the same thing. For those who don't know, Illustrator is sort of a more traditional, Illustrator-based graphics program. It's especially great for creating vector images and working in typography and with very simple outlines and shapes and basic sort of composition. To a lesser extent, I also use Indesign, which is primarily for print layout, but also has some features geared towards creating interactive PDFs or ebooks. I don't do as much still photography as I used to. I wish I did more, but I still use Lightroom, and Lightroom, for those who don't know, is a really great photo editor that is, it basically offers a much more streamlined process, a faster workflow for those working with lots of raw image files than loading everything individually into something like Photoshop. I'm just cheating and looking at my computer because I've docked basically all the applications at the bottom. Adobe programs, it's 90% of what I do on this computer. I've also got Adobe Audition on here, which is their audio editor. As much as I'm sure that something like Pro Tools is more the industry standard. For me as a filmmaker, somebody without a lot of audio experience but who occasionally needs to edit or convert audio files, it's handy to have that. And of course I use Acrobat. Who doesn't use Acrobat? It's still sort of the standard for creating, combining, printing, and proofing PDFs for both print and digital purposes. So for all that really fun administrative office crap, there's Acrobat. I think I mentioned some programs have become retired, so let's just talk about that for a minute. So by far the worst experience I had with Creative Cloud over the last 2 years relates to a program by the name of Speedgrade. Those of you who have been doing film and video work in the past 10 years are probably familiar with Speedgrade. Unfortunately, it never really caught on, but it was basically Adobe's answer to professional color correction or color grading. For what it's worth, I actually really liked Speedgrade. I found the controls of the UI and the user experience very intuitive. It ran pretty fast on my machine, and of course it integrated pretty well with Premiere. There wasn't actually as many integration features as I expected. It was pretty clear that they hadn't updated it since they'd updated Premiere. And I probably should have taken that as a warning sign that it was not going to be part of the suite moving forward, and not to invest too much time or energy in learning that software or using that software or building my workflow around it. But this is kind of the issue with Adobe, is you never really know what their plans are a year out. They move pretty rapidly. That's how they can stay competitive. It's how they have a lot of the best software in the world. It's also one of the challenges that you'll face if you're really trying to build out an entire studio or operation around Adobe software. At least I think more so than something that's, a one-time purchase of $2,000. Most software companies are not going to sell you a piece of software for $2,000 and then stop supporting it in a year, because that would just be extremely unpopular. I think Adobe has a little bit of an out because they are on a subscription basis. So this particular example with Speedgrade, I did a couple of feature films actually that I graded entirely in Speedgrade. Had a pretty good experience with it, but it came time that the studio I was working for at the time was upgrading all their software. I guess Adobe Creative Cloud, probably 2017, had just come out, and there was a lot of new features that we wanted to take advantage of with After Effects and Premiere. I didn't tell everyone not to upgrade. I didn't even think about it twice, to be honest. It did occur to me that Speedgrade was no longer on the list of software updates for that generation, but by then it was too late. Not only did Speedgrade not receive an update, but the new version of Premiere for basically the first generation that Speedgrade wasn't included in the suite at all was completely incompatible with Speedgrade. And I can't remember all the details, but it was something to the effect that I was literally locked out of my Speedgrade project forever. I think what happened is that I opened the latest version of the project in the new version of Premiere, and once I opened it in Premiere, it updated the project file to the new version, whereas there was no new version of Speedgrade, if that makes sense, and it wouldn't downgrade the file again to be compatible with the old software even though I had the old software. Sorry if that's really complicated and nerdy, but long story short, without any warning, it basically locked me out of a project that I had spent a week working on. So it could have been really, really bad. That could have been a very, very expensive issue. And it kind of still was, from what I recall. After doing a lot of research and talking to a few people in customer service, I finally got through to somebody who patched me through to somebody else in support, and they basically, remotely logged onto my computer and installed all kinds of old software trying to restore the system and trying to restore the file to a point where I could open it. I had backups of the file, even they were no longer compatible. It was a big mess, and I'm sorry I can't remember all the details. I don't even really remember how it was resolved. I think I was basically able to recover an older version of the project, but I still lost days of work. And needless to say, I never used Speedgrade again. And that's sort of an extreme example of some of the risks that come with a subscription-based service. Now, Adobe does have something else basically built right into Premiere, which makes a lot more sense for color grading. They're really pushing their Lumetri looks, but I have to say it's still not really up to snuff. It's not as user-friendly, nor is it seemingly as powerful as software available from other companies, and I think there's a good reason why the gold standard in professional color grading, for example, still belongs to other companies. Increasingly, I think that's DaVinci with their Resolve system, which is now what I use on a day-to-day basis for color grading. And that kind of sucks, I gotta say. I mean, I love Resolve, and it's actually a free program. We'll talk about that in a minute. But when you're paying $50 a month for a suite that's specifically advertised as being, the full enchilada, you're supposed to be able to take a film project all the way through post-production without ever leaving the Adobe ecosystem. That's the dream, that's the vision. That's really the selling point of something like Adobe. So to be paying that money and then to have to take your project out of, Premiere, put it back into Resolve, and then heaven forbid you have to edit anything again, take it back to Premiere. I mean, there are ways to do it. And, before the sort of idea of these, full suite ecosystems, nobody would have thought twice about it. But again, when you're paying $50 a month, you don't want to go elsewhere. You don't want to basically rely on a separate suite, a separate company's software, and especially, if it's something that's free and it's better than what you're paying $50 a month for in that one particular department. It I think it rubs people the wrong way. Certainly, it's a bit of a hard sell for me with my coworkers sometimes because, it is an extra step. I essentially introduced the software to a studio that I work for, and I think it's worked out really well for them, but how much harder of a sell is it when you have to say, oh yeah, but you still have to, go into this other free program, and yeah, that company that offers the free program also has editing software, but this one's better. It's $50 a month and that one's free, and you still have to rely on the free one. And I think Adobe's challenge is choosing its battles. It's such a broad and massive product offering, which is its strength and its weakness. No other company that I can think of has software that is for that many different industries. It's all for creative professionals, and there's all kinds of overlap in that, and I'm probably a good example. And how awesome is it that I don't need to know a completely different type of software for my graphic design than I do for special effects for film. That's great. That's amazing, actually. And I feel really blessed and lucky to live in a time when that's possible. But at the same time, if Adobe was just focused, for example, on film, they could have some, killer, like even development or pre-development or pre-production tools, and they could have, a really good color grading software, and they could have, Adobe Premiere would be completely unrivaled in terms of its power as a nonlinear video editor. As is, I feel like Premiere has gotten a lot better over the years, and it's probably one of the best video editors that's still, fairly traditional in its user interface and style, I guess. After Effects is still the best program ever, but more and more I think motion graphics and visual effects artists need to rely on 3D programs just to stay current and relevant, and those programs are starting to integrate more of the feature set that After Effects has. We've seen things like Flash, which was great at bridging both the film and animation world with interactive and software development. And now that Flash has sort of been superseded by other programs, I think Adobe's lost ground in both those fields to other companies. So on the one hand, it makes sense that Adobe is really beefing up and focusing on its strengths, which I think... And that's a power outage, so I'll catch up with you guys in a bit. Okay, and we're back, just like that. There you go, the joys of rural living, except I'm actually in a city. It's just a small city on an island. Where was I? Anyways, it makes sense that Adobe focuses on particular programs and lets certain things go, and maybe that was their decision with something like Speedgrade. That's not an area they were most competitive in. Other companies that were offering not just superior color grading software, but also hardware to go along with it and cameras that were integrated, like, Blackmagic with DaVinci. So, they picked their battles, and you can't blame them for doing it. But at the same time, I think that's the constant struggle that they face, is selling themselves as the complete collection, the full suite, and at the same time staying competitive when they have their fingers in so many different things that are so diverse. I get the sense, though, also that Adobe feels the need to really introduce brand new products or new technologies and new software increasingly as ways to advertise the entire Creative Cloud to people who maybe aren't already subscribers. And it is exciting when they announce something brand new, like, Character Animator, for example, for free, because we're already subscribers. I get to goof around with that software now, and not just on a trial basis, but I can actually use it. Something that I imagined that I would have access to, and suddenly I do. That's an incredible value. It's really exciting. But it's also frustrating, again, when there's things like, when there's kind of more practical or sensible programs that I think more people in more industries would use, would be more applicable to the industry where the majority of subscribers are from. When we're lacking those programs, but instead we have things like, these apps, like mobile apps that Adobe are developing that, color in black and white images, or, things like Adobe Character Animator. Obviously, there's certain industries where that's going to be really important and exciting. For YouTube creators, for example, for individuals, I think, who like to dabble in lots of different things, that's amazing. And maybe Adobe's realizing that that's really their strength and that's now their target, but it probably is coming at the cost of other things, like, for example, color correction for film, for the professional film industry. And so, it's a give and take battle. So that's just something to be aware of as well. And that's why I think at the end of the day, the Adobe Creative Cloud is absolutely worth the money if you're somebody who just loves to create, and you love technology and you find it exciting to experiment and learn in as many different fields, creative fields, as you can. If you're a YouTube creator, if you're an independent marketer, graphic designer, if you're an indie software developer, I think it's a must-have program for all those people, and for really small companies as well. I think it's perfect. If you consider yourself a specialist in anything other than, visual effects or graphic design, there's probably more competitive options out there that are priced more competitively as well, and maybe sort of more practical in their rollout and the way that they are distributed and presented. In terms of the subscription-based model, I think there's sort of three primary advantages. One is, again, having access to new software as it comes out, always being on the cutting edge. Two is basically support. And the third one is flexibility. So how do those three things actually pan out? In terms of, being on the cutting edge, yeah, absolutely. Adobe is, as I think I mentioned, really competitive. For how well tested most of their software is, it's amazing how early it comes out, how often new releases come out. There is occasionally weird issues that come with that, even if you have everything updated and to spec all the time. For example, even between Adobe Premiere and Adobe Encoder, almost with every release, there's some kind of weird glitch or issue where Adobe software won't encode video edited with Adobe software in a codec that Adobe supports. Just where there's really no excuse for things to go wrong, there's often problems at the end of the day. But you come to expect that with any software to a certain extent, and it's still, I think, less so than trying to transfer projects between software from different manufacturers or different operating systems, for example. And that's another huge strength that I haven't even talked about with Adobe, which is the cross-compatibility between PCs and Macs. And that's amazing. It really, really, really is. I don't know if anyone else has really perfected that to the extent that Adobe has. 2, in terms of the support thing, for the most part, it's, yeah, absolutely as advertised. I've called up Adobe a few times, usually with like hardcore kind of technical issues, and got, for the most part, really good customer support. They create a lot of resources to help their subscribers learn about the feature set of new software, which is great. You know, they have video tutorials, they have forums for their community. The forums are kind of interesting because a few times actually, particularly in the online forums, also with other types of customer support to various degrees, I found they've actually been odd. I don't know how else to put it. It's sort of as if Adobe has a very unique customer service training regime, and it's maybe problematic but also refreshing at the same time. I'll cut to the chase. What I mean is, frankly, the customer service that I've seen and experienced is usually quite rude, but very helpful, ultimately. They really don't pussyfoot around the issues, and if you go on Adobe forums, you'll often see this where people ask a question and then actually get really infuriated because the response from Adobe is less than apologetic, and even when it's sort of something that you would consider to be Adobe's issue, if there's a workaround, if there's something that they think you should know as a user of X program, they're going to let you know that you should probably know how to do that. You know, they stop short of actually calling you stupid, but frankly, it often comes across as really condescending, which is sort of, you know, why it seems like, and I think this is something probably that they are more so conscious of now than maybe a few years ago, but I think a lot of their support people are also, I get the sense, are also engineers maybe, or they certainly come from a software engineering background, which is great because those are the people who really understand and know the issues and can be very open with the public about why certain things are happening, why certain updates are required. But I get the sense that a lot of the Adobe reps who post on the forums in particular have not been trained in customer service in terms of appeasing people, right? So again, that's something that some people would consider unacceptable. I just kind of find it entertaining and amusing. As long as they tell me what I need to do, I'm cool. And on the phone, you know, the kind of more traditional customer support methods have been really satisfactory. You know, besides that one thing with Speedgrade, which didn't work out so well. But, you know, ultimately, I don't find I have to wait online. I don't find that they're ever short with me. They never try and upsell me on other support packages or, you know, training or anything like that. For the most part, I know the software pretty well, so my questions tend to relate to just changes in the software or, you know, actual technical problems I'm having. But I found their customer support really good for the most part. And that leaves the advantage of flexibility. I guess I'm spoiled because it really is so flexible compared to other programs. You know, I still see a lot of people post on like Facebook. Sometimes people ask me, they're like, oh, you have Adobe, right? Can I just like borrow this, you know, one software for a couple days? And that used to be like a big problem, a big deal, right? You wanted to use Illustrator to convert like one vector logo. Oh, that's how you do it, Illustrator? Okay, well, I'll find a friend who owns that because I'm not going to pay, you know, $800 to buy Illustrator. Nowadays, there's really no excuse for piracy. If you need to do something, you can pay, you know, $20 or something and get Illustrator for a month and do whatever you want with it. You can save up all your Illustrator projects for, you know, 2 years if you have that kind of flexibility. Pay $20, use Illustrator for a month intensively, and then, you know, quit the subscription. That's pretty good value when you look at it that way. So we really are spoiled in terms of the flexibility that we have in accessing this software and the overall accessibility. You don't need to have thousands of dollars in the bank. You don't need to be a business or a company to make it feasible. Of course, it does add up, and it is more expensive over time depending on how often you would otherwise be updating the software. In my mind, what is the best value by far is the complete Adobe suite, which is $50 a month, but with the stipulation that you buy it on an annual basis. And that's why I'm in this situation where I've been locked in for a year and then was locked in for another year. There was periods of a few months in there where I was working full-time for different employers instead of as a freelancer. They had their own software. I was using their software. I was using my own software very, very little in those times, and it's frustrating to be in a situation where you have to pay more basically to get out of the contract then you might just pay month to month as you go, staying locked in the contract. Anyone who's had a cell phone probably, at least in North America, knows the struggle, right? So that's not so fun. And I also think Adobe could offer more flexibility in the other packages they have. For any one piece of software, I mentioned $20 a month, and that comes with 100 gigabytes of cloud storage. So, and then they also have one that's for photographers, and it's just $10 for, you don't get the cloud storage or the same amount of cloud storage, but you get Photoshop, you get Lightroom, I forget a couple other goodies in there as well. And that's a really good deal. I mean, for photographers, that is the package that you need. But it's sort of ironic that if you want just Photoshop, if you're a graphic designer, for example, it actually costs more to get just Photoshop than if you're a photographer and you get Photoshop and Lightroom. And they actually advertise Photoshop as sort of one of the single pieces of software that you might pay $20 to get. I'm sure it's one of their most popular. It's still their flagship program, right? Why can't you just get Photoshop with 100 gigabytes of storage for $10 a month? Why don't they have a package for graphic designers with Photoshop and Illustrator and Indesign for $30 a month? You know, why don't they have one for filmmakers for $40 a month that is Premiere and After Effects and Media Encoder? There's a lot of different ways that they could break it up for different industries, and a lot of people would save a lot of money, and I guess that's why, you know, they don't want to do it. They just draw the line at, well, if you have 3 or more programs, you may as well just get all dozen programs and, you know, pay for it for a year. And fair enough, I suppose, but just be aware that when you see, you know, the full extent of programs that are offered to you for $50 a month, there's very, very, very few people who are really going to want to take advantage of all the software in the suite. So really read up on what those things are, maybe play around with the trials and decide if those are things that that are valuable to you in any way. So the flexibility is awesome. Maybe not as awesome as it could be, but it's still pretty great compared to other forms of software. And I mentioned before, like with the example of DaVinci, there's other competitors who are trying other models that are probably more competitive, right? DaVinci, for example, offers Resolve for free. That's a pretty powerful editor. It's getting much better. Some of the kind of post-processing, the color grading, but also the filters that you can apply to the film and video and raw video support is bar none really, really amazing stuff that DaVinci's doing now. With a lot of kind of codecs in certain formats now, DaVinci is actually a lot faster than Adobe. And I think building something like a video editor from the ground up is probably comparatively simple to building an effects program or a color grading software that's much more kind of technical in a lot of ways. And so in that regard, it's going to be really interesting to see in particular what DaVinci, but also Apple and other competitors bring to the table over the next few years to really take on Adobe. And if Adobe can maintain the advantage that it has right now, primarily just with After Effects, because that's where their film and video stuff shines. Over the last 2 years, I've seen really exciting, fantastic updates with After Effects in particular. That's obviously one of the areas that Adobe's focused on heavily. A lot of the effects in there have become just so much faster to render and rasterize. They developed some really exciting technology in 3D tracking, and I think they're getting a lot better with things like mask tracking. So my work has become, you know, noticeably easier on a day-to-day basis over the last 2 years. Photoshop also is something that they're always updating, and I do use a lot of the new features in that. For the other software, most of the updates that they do have just sort of pertain to connectivity with other software that they're introducing. So for example, I don't know if this is even true, but After Effects, you know, might have an update to support Character Animator because it makes sense that there would be really close integration. And they include just sort of very basic UI enhancements, and those are really hit and miss for me. Illustrator is one program where I find they've made quite a few changes recently to the way that things like the pen tool and the pencil tool function, in particular editing Bezier curves and stuff like that. Every time they introduce something new in Illustrator, honestly, I just feel like it complicates my life. It just takes some time to figure out, okay, well, what does that do now? You know, hitting A used to do this, now I have to zoom in that close to be, you know, right on a particular pixel for it to react the way that it used to react. And most of these are things that you can change with preferences. For example, like they have the default kind of layout on the screen, and you know, they have one that I think in Illustrator is called Essentials, and now I find I have to go to Essentials Classic, which, because Essentials just gets more and more essential every year. It's like they take more and more things away, and I think they're basically trying to make the software more newbie friendly, more user friendly, and that makes sense because Illustrator is amazing. Illustrator is my very favorite Adobe program and probably my favorite software in the world. I just love like playing in Adobe Illustrator. It's just pure entertainment. It's really, once you get a hang of it, it's a blast. It's just a visual playground. And not enough people use it, and I think they're trying to maybe encourage more people to use it by making it more user-friendly, making it more accessible and discoverable for people who are new to it. But for folks like me who are just like very used to the way it used to function, it's just kind of frustrating. Again, anyone who remembers like going from Final Cut 7 to Final Cut 10, it's that kind of learning curve. And if you stick with it, you'll probably find that the new software, you know, they really haven't lost a lot of the functionality. Everything, the changes that they've made are logical. But on the other hand, when you're like so accustomed to the way something works, when you know all the shortcuts and you're so fast in it anyways, what's the value in it changing for you? It's diminishing returns at that point. Those updates are going to have for users, and it really can just sort of be distracting or even destructive to your workflow. So I would say, in particular, as an example, if you're a print designer and you are working in Adobe CS5 or CS6 on InDesign and Illustrator primarily, and considering upgrading, I would say probably don't bother, to be honest, unless you find that you need to bring in assets that are, you know, linked assets with Photoshop and you keep getting stuff from clients that you can't open because it's the newer software or something. There's not a ton of real big advantages with the Creative Cloud in more of the, you know, traditional software. It's more sort of the cutting edge stuff or the integration that's really improving over time. So I think probably the only thing that I have not talked about at this point is the cloud itself. I should add another little disclaimer here. I'm pretty skeptical, I guess, about the whole cloud thing. I mean, just the way that it's marketed as something really new and innovative, and it's not. I mean, it's just, again, it's hard drives somewhere else accessible through a server. You know, it's not actually floating up in space somewhere. I don't know if that would be an advantage if it was. The way I look at it is just that you are buying on a monthly basis or renting a hard drive from somebody. And that hard drive, you know, you have the advantage of connectivity through the internet, but you could do that yourself with a company or home server, or, you know, there's other ways to do that. And in terms of the actual integration of Adobe's cloud system with their software, it's really not as robust as I expected. And it's not as intuitive either. I've never used it for the first year and a half, to be honest. In fact, for part of that time, I was paying separately for a Dropbox subscription just because, again, it's something that a lot of clients were using, and they all wanted me to have Dropbox. Nobody wanted me to have Adobe Creative Cloud because it's not something that they could access as non-subscribers. So the functionality of that is limited. You might think it would be really powerful for sharing files with other Adobe users, but even that is a little bit clunky. There's not sort of a streamlined way to do that. Really, the only way that I find that it's integrated with the software is that in something like Photoshop or Illustrator, you know, basically one of your libraries can be things in your cloud. Otherwise, it just sort of works like Dropbox or something. It's nice to have, it's a nice bonus, but for me, there's no way that it's worth getting Creative Cloud for over CS5 or CS6 if that's the only reason you're considering upgrading. Unless maybe you were going to pay $50 a month anyways for 100 gigabytes with some other service. But I'm pretty sure other providers at this point are a lot cheaper. And when there's, you know, basically like free file transfer sites that do 10 gigabytes, you know, in a single transfer, when you can upload 100 gigabyte video files to YouTube for free, or get Vimeo subscriptions and transfer like 422 HQ QuickTime files that are 120 gigabytes and play them back on the site, and, you know, have them password protected and all this stuff, all this other integration. Once you put all that in perspective, the cloud services that Adobe is offering, it kind of loses its allure. I think they do offer you like a portfolio website and some other connectivity with things like Behance and some other little goodies related to the cloud service. That's stuff that honestly I haven't played around with too much, and I probably should, but I'm kind of surprised how little they actually integrate that or push that or promote that or make that sort of discoverable to existing Creative Cloud subscribers. And frankly, it's just not kind of something that's really applicable to me right now, so maybe that would add a lot more value to another type of user. The last piece of the puzzle, that's something that Adobe is pushing quite a lot, is Adobe Stock. Adobe Stock is basically Adobe's proprietary database of stock photos, images, assets. Maybe it includes videos at this point. If you ever use something like Pond 5 or Shutterstock, well, this is Adobe's version of that. And as you can imagine, it is more actually integrated in the software. They make it that much easier to grab stuff from Adobe Stock. They even use things like Adobe Stock images to fill in like content-aware fill backgrounds in Photoshop, which is where it basically identifies certain features and textures in a photograph and will replace portions of that photograph with another photograph that they selected from Adobe Stock that looks like it could fit and match, and it blends in really amazingly well. It's some pretty amazing kind of technological voodoo. They don't actually force you to subscribe to Adobe Stock to use all of those features, luckily, but it is very integrated, and I think it's something that increasingly you're going to need to subscribe to get the most out of the Adobe Creative Cloud. I think it's a really, really smart area for Adobe to expand into. It just makes a lot of sense. However, again, I feel like they should have probably just made it very price competitive at the beginning, regardless of the inclusion in other software packages, because right now it's expensive enough that even most Adobe Creative Cloud subscribers would find cheaper options outside of Adobe. It makes sense that it might be more expensive to somebody who's cross-shopping with something like Shutterstock because of the advantages that it brings to Photoshop, but for somebody who's already subscribed to Photoshop, frankly, I just kind of feel like it should be cheaper, or it should be included, or at least included to an extent with your $50 a month subscription fee. And when I say should be, I don't mean I feel entitled to it. I just sort of mean from a business standpoint, it would make, I think, a lot more sense for Adobe to gain as many new Adobe Stock users as possible within its first year of existence. And I kind of worry that it might not take off. And the only reason I worry about it is because, again, that's more time and investment that Adobe's making in something that might not have long-term value. And it's not really my place, but I guess that's sort of the only anxiety I have about Adobe as a company moving forward. Again, it's just that they're so dispersed with every other initiative that they take on. With every new piece of software they build, it seems like probably 7 or 8 in 10 of those only last a few years. And that's all time and energy and money that could be spent on research and development for the software that we all really love and use on a daily basis, that still has some slowdown, still has some issues, is still in some cases struggling to keep up with the competition. So as you may have figured out at this point, I'm basically an Adobe fanboy. I love their tools. I really want them to succeed as a company. I love the integration of all their software. I've been using it forever, and I don't ever want to stop using it. So why am I considering ending my subscription next month? It's just that I'm basically doing 90% of my work now for other studios and companies where I'm using their hardware and their software and their licenses. They have business licenses and other agreements. And so it becomes a question of, well, is it really worth $50 a month for me for, the 2 or 3 hours that I might spend using it any given week on personal projects or other things that are not really strictly work related, or maybe the extra, odd freelance gig that I might pick up on a weekend. And it's much harder to justify at that point, especially if it comes to a point where I'm no longer self-employed and I can't claim it as a business expense. And that's sort of why I feel like there's maybe a missing gap a little bit in Adobe product offering right now. $50 a month is nothing for somebody who's making thousands of dollars off freelance contracts or gigs where they're using this software. But for a casual user, somebody who's learning, somebody who's just a hobbyist, somebody who's a YouTuber but isn't doing it full time or making a lot of money. For the record, I was making about $50 a month off YouTube for the last couple months, which is great. I was like, okay, it'll cover Adobe Creative Cloud. That's exactly what I'll put that money towards. YouTube will be demonetizing me. That's another discussion. No hard feelings. It's basically because I don't have enough subscribers and I'm just getting started. But I do start to kind of question the value and the cost of Adobe Creative Cloud for me as an individual instead of me as a business. If they had something that was limited by time, limited maybe by the number of different programs you could open in a given month, or what would make even more sense is limited by license. If they could somehow basically watermark all your content, and so you couldn't use it professionally, but you could use it for personal projects, for learning, for these things where it doesn't really matter to present that same professional image, where something like a watermark wouldn't matter. They could really offer a cheaper price and basically build their branding and build their audience and build even more awareness and support and buy-in basically from the creative and artistic community. So in conclusion, I absolutely love Adobe software. In terms of the Creative Cloud as a whole, I like it a lot. Maybe don't love it as much as the software that's in it. The subscription model makes a lot of sense in this economy. It makes a lot of sense with most creative industries, the way that they're structured right now. I think it absolutely is the future, whether you like it or not. And I think Adobe is making that future pretty bright and pretty exciting. So with all those caveats in mind, I would say absolutely go ahead and give Adobe Creative Cloud a try for a few months at the very least. So it's not for everyone, it's not perfect, and that's why I really encourage everyone to just go through, read as much as they can about the different programs, and most importantly, get a trial, because it's free. Why not? Give the programs a try, or just try it, paid for a couple months, and see how it pans out for you. My name's Joseph, you've been watching Buzz Cuts. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'm really curious to hear in the comments below what your experience has been with Creative Cloud. If you've been a subscriber, if you're considering subscribing to Creative Cloud but you're not yet, let me know in the comments below. Maybe what's holding you back, and if you're still using CS5 or CS6, what's your experience like been using that? Do you find it starting to get too out of date, or is it still really practical for you? Let us all know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys subscribe for more creative filmmaking and tech tutorials and reviews, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks so much.